Why can't they just sit still? It's not like I want them to sit for an hour. But while I'm telling the lesson, if they could at least wait until I get my point across. But no, they want to wiggle. They want to walk around the room. They want to talk to their neighbor. As the content manager of Able Ministry, if it's one thing I get, it's calls from Sunday school teachers. And it's usually they've got that one kid. You know that one kid who is sweet and adorable one minute, and the next minute they're screaming at the top of their lungs or climbing on the bookcases. I'm not joking. Climbing on the bookcases. Or maybe they're not cute. Maybe they're just rude and rebellious and they want their own way. What do? Do we just ban them from coming to children's ministry events? No, that's not the answer. Do we just quit and let somebody else deal with them? No, that's probably not the answer either. So today we're going to talk about a few things. First, we'll talk about the ABCs of behavior. And then we'll talk about behavior that appears out of nowhere. Or did it? Let's talk about those early warning signs. And finally, let's learn about how some kids can regulate their emotions and what to do with those who can't. Before I go too far, I do want to say that this session is brought to you by Able Ministry, which is the disability ministry of the UPCI and a program within Ladies Ministries. I also want to give a slight disclaimer. I'm not a medical professional, and I'm not giving medical advice. There are people who have behaviors due to a medical condition or a disability, and there are professional therapists and behavioral specialists who can assist with those types of behaviors. You can find them at schools or at medical facilities. That being said, this training is to help you in your classroom to decipher behaviors, whether that's with typical kids or kids affected by disability. Let's start simple. We're going to talk about the ABCs of behavior. And the B in the ABCs stands for behavior. Let's look at this kid. He's got some behavior. He is running. We don't know why. We don't know how he's feeling. We just know he's running. And if we could see his face, we might have some clues. Is he happy? Is he sad? Is he frustrated? We don't know. But what do we know about this kid? We know that he loves to move. We know that he never sits still. Does that remind you of anyone? Based on what you know about him, why do you think he's running? Well, to figure that out, we need to figure out what happened first. So let's zoom out. What you don't know is that he hates dogs. One time a dog knocked him down. So every time he sees a dog, he has to run away from it. So using the theory of the ABCs of behavior, we say the dog triggered the behavior, or the dog was the A, the antecedent, or what happened first. The B is the behavior, as I said before, or the response, running. And the final thing is the consequence, or what does he get out of his behavior? It can be a good thing or a bad thing. In this case, his running behavior helps him to do what? Escape the dog. Yeah. And not be eaten or jumped on or whatever. So let's bring this behavior into a church setting. Same behavior, different trigger. So you're doing children's ministry, and it's never when you're looking, and he runs out of the room, and he runs down the hallway. Now, following the same logic, if he's looking to escape something, what is the trigger? What are they escaping from in our typical Sunday school classroom? Have you been to our typical Sunday school classroom? Especially with the little ones at the beginning or the end of the class. Whew, it can get loud. So, if you have a kid who is overwhelmed by sound easily, or activity, or movement, or chaos, Sunday school or kids' church can have a lot of triggers. So to figure out exactly what the kid wants, what is the trigger, right? So what is the need that causes the behavior? Work backwards. So what does the behavior get them? What is the reward? And then what need is that meeting? And so let's just talk about what possible needs there might be that you could provide. One is the need for peace and quiet, right? And so how can you give that to them in the classroom? You might need noise canceling headphones, right? That might help them find peace and quiet in the classroom. A cheaper option is just earplugs, right? I carry these in my purse all the time just in case I see a kid putting their hands over their ears. Maybe your classroom is, you like to play screamy games, you like to pop balloons, and that's a trigger, right? So if you eliminate screamy games and popping balloons, then you won't have the behavior that it causes. Sometimes the need is for movement. So how do we give that in the classroom? Well, you could have a mini trampoline in the back, which I love. And I mean, granted, you're going to have a conversation with the typical kids, right? And explain that God made our bodies different, and some kids need movement in order to focus and learn, and some kids, their body needs to be calm. And if you're a person whose body needs to be calm, then you don't need to be jumping on the trampoline. I learned the hard way, if you take an entire classroom of Sunday school kids and have them jump up and down, you will not get calm. Do these experiments. It's helpful in your learning. Oh, do you have that kid that needs to touch everything? Right? That's their need. They just need to touch everything. Give them a fidget. I'd rather have them touch a fidget than touch the hair of the person next to them, right? I wish that every classroom knew how to do fidgets. I wish that every kid knew that some kids need a fidget to help them focus, right? If your body doesn't need a fidget, then you don't need a fidget. But if you need a fidget, use a fidget. There are some rules around fidgets. So the first rule is don't take your fidget and whack your neighbor with it. The other rule around fidgets is you don't want to be distracting to everybody behind you. Yeah. And you also want to be quiet. So there are some fidgets that are loud and noisy, so you probably want to avoid those. So we focused a lot on escape and movement needs. Let's talk about other behaviors, unexpected behaviors that appear out of nowhere. So everyone is playing nicely, and then all of a sudden somebody's mad, and they're screaming and throwing things, or they're sad and they're crying. What do you think? What do you say? If your first thought is, what just happened? You're looking for the A in the ABCs of behavior. So what was the trigger? But if the trigger isn't one that you see as logical, how can you figure out what the trigger is? And so the first thing I would say is just talk to the parent, right? They know their kid best. Don't be judgy about it. Don't be like, your kid's really mean. Why are they hitting other kids? Don't do that. But you might say, your kid tends to throw things a lot when they're mad. What does this happen at home? And what do you do when that behavior happens? Right? Hopefully the parent knows exactly what to do. If the parent doesn't know, and it's like, I have never seen that behavior, I don't know what you're talking about, then what you want to do is you want to get somebody into the classroom and you want them to observe. And I would recommend that it not be the main teacher. If you're the main teacher, get somebody else in there. So at my church, I am the inclusion specialist, which means when there's behavior, I get called. And I will just go in and watch kids and see if I can figure out the ABCs, right? See if I can figure out what happened, what's going on, and then why are they doing what they're doing. So we use a form. You don't have to use a form, but here's a form that might work for you. So you'll notice at the top, we've got time, like when during the class did it happen? What happened first? What was the behavior? And what happened then? So often you just know the behavior, right? But if you really are intentional about tracking it, these are some things to do. So I'm going to tell you a story, and then we'll fill out the form, and then we'll figure out, we'll play detective here. So teacher came to me and said, there's this kid that they just cry all the time in my class. I don't know why. And I mean, the teacher doesn't want it, not just from disruption standpoint, like they don't want the kid to be in distress. And so the first time I watched was on a Sunday. And just so you know, this is not a real kid. Names and dates and times and details have been changed. So it was a Sunday. The kids were playing. The kid was dropped off by their dad. And the kid didn't want the dad to leave, but finally he says, no, I gotta go. The dad leaves, little girl goes over, sits by herself at a table, just kind of sits there for a little while, so we're okay with her just sitting there, but then she starts to cry after a couple of minutes. And so I went over and tried to give her a hug, and she just pushed me away, and that was not something she wanted. And then she was fine for the rest of the class, snack and story, and she was fine. So then on Wednesday night, I observed her, and drop-off was fine. The kids were playing with toys. She played with them for a little while. It was a little bit loud, but then she went over to the corner of her room by herself and just kind of sat there, and her face looked really sad. And then after a minute, she started to cry. And so I tried to distract her. I gave her a toy, and that worked. That worked okay. And she was able to, join in and be fine for the rest of the class. So I'm like, okay, great. Maybe we figured this out. And then it was Sunday again. And so drop off was fine again. She was fine the whole class. But then at the very end, kids were playing at the kitchen with Play-Doh, play food, and she was playing with them for a while, but then I noticed she went over and sat at the table by herself and was looking sad. And so I decided to be a little proactive this time, and I grabbed a puzzle and I asked her to play, and she was fine. All right, so as we look at this form, what do you see? Do you see it? So we're looking for trends. It isn't always at the beginning of class. It isn't always at the end. What I do notice is that it's never during snack. It's never during story. It's never during like the structured parts of the class. It always happened when kids were playing independently. So the other thing I noticed, and you probably did too, is that she would sit by herself right before the behavior. And so often before the behavior, there will be an early warning sign. And this is something that happens between the trigger and the behavior. And if you can step in right there, like I did with the puzzle, you often won't have the behavior. So watch for those early warning signs. For some kids, they might be more whiny. They might start growling at you. They might be frustrated. Some kids can be manic, like running around the room and laughing and then all of a sudden it all falls apart. And they might shut down like this one. Like they might just isolate, get by themselves, and then have a hard time. So figure out those early warning signs. With this kid, what was the actual trigger? I'm not sure. It was always during free time. I don't know if it just was like too much, like too chaotic, too loud, too whatever. Or if there was some social things that they didn't get, or I don't know. But in the end, we were able to meet the need and step in and redirect. And that behavior is no longer occurring, which is often the case with behavior. So you figured out the trigger. You figured out the early warning signs. You figured out the behavior. What do? You take all of that and you put it in a spiritual IEP. And what is a spiritual IEP? IEP stands for Individualized Education Plan. We get that wording from the school district. Basically, it's a tool. It's a form. It was created so that the Sunday school teacher and the parent could identify what that kid needs for support. But really where it's helpful is in situations where you have behavior, you figure it out, and you know what to do. And so in this kid's spiritual IEP, during that time when that behavior was still occurring, we put it in there and said, if you notice that the kid is isolating themselves, the kid is looking really sad, redirect, offer them something to do, let them help them with that. It often happens during times whenever all the kids are playing independently, right? You distribute that to all the teachers, all the helpers, all the workers in the room, and then everybody knows what to do, and that kid is fully supported. One of the milestones of typically developing kids is the ability to regulate your emotions. So what does that mean? Think about how a 3-year-old handles disappointment, and then think about how a 9-year-old handles disappointment, right? So they might feel the same thing, like, but they don't react in exactly the same way because they've learned to regulate their emotions. If you have a child that is developmentally delayed or has a disability, they can have difficulties regulating their emotions. So what does that look like? They go from 0 to 60 in 1 second. Everybody is playing calmly, and then suddenly they are screaming and crying, right? So they might not be an evil child. They might just have difficulty controlling their response, controlling their emotions. And so what do? There are times when emotions pop up. So let's talk through those and how can we make those times easier for kids who have difficulty regulating their emotions. The first time is when there are transitions. So if you are playing with your most favorite toy, and I tell you, you got to stop now, put it away, it's time to do something else. That can be triggering. That can be hard emotionally. And so one way to support kids is to give them warning. Give them a 5-minute warning. Give them a 4-minute warning, then a 3, then a 2, then a 1. And then set your phone with a timer and have your phone timer go off and have your phone tell everybody that it's time to pick up cleanup, right? And have a little song to sing, right? Barney has a great song about picking up and cleaning up. You might want to use that. You might want to use something else, but something that is calming and regulating and help them move to the next thing. The other thing that can be difficult is sharing. Some kids can't share well. Some kids need their own toys to play with. Some kids like to play by themselves. That's okay. Some kids like to play with other kids, but they don't like other kids touching their toys. They like their own toys. They like to play parallel with other kids, which is perfectly fine. Another time whenever emotions can pop up is when there's a winner and a loser, right? And you lose. I mean, sometimes adults struggle with this. The other time that emotions can pop up is when there's accidents. So if I accidentally bump you, if I accidentally knock over your tower, right? Any of those types of things can trigger emotion. And so often it is helpful whenever teachers will step in and say, oh, that they didn't do that on purpose. That was an accident. Make sure you say sorry. Sometimes a sorry can go a long way. In some cases, it's just personality. So some kids, you knock over their tower of blocks, and they just pick them up and start again. Some kids, it's the end of the world. And sometimes there are physical things that affect our ability to handle disappointment or regulate our emotions. So things like, I'm hungry. Hangry is a real thing. Just ask my husband, poor guy, when we first got married. But I digress. If you're tired, if you're sad, right, you might not respond in the best manner. Do kids eat breakfast before they walk into your class? I mean, it might be helpful to serve some kind of a healthy snack at the very beginning of class, just to get kids so they're not hungry. Now, granted, if your snack is Oreo cookies and Kool-Aid, you might want to wait till the end of class to have that. Because sugar can be a real trigger for some kids. Not all, just some. I mean, and family situations can affect us, right? So if your parents are arguing a lot, or your pet just died, or you were up all night because of the thunderstorm, all of that can make you feel less than your best. And kids show up sick. I know that's hard to believe, but sometimes kids don't feel well whenever they walk into your class. I will never forget, there was a little boy who was playing with some toys, and another little one walked up to him and wanted that toy and just took it. And so then the little kid starts crying, and so then the teacher intervenes, and she's like, oh, no, we don't take toys from our friends. Please, you need to apologize. Give that back and say you're sorry. And that kid was having none of that. And so he grabbed the toy back and whacks the kid across the face. So now you've got the first little boy who was playing quietly by himself is now crying. The one who wanted the toy is now crying. The whacker is screaming at the top of his lungs that he wants his mom. And we're like, oh yes, your mom, that's a good solution. So we take the little kid upstairs, we hand him to his parent, he gets in the parent's lap, puts his head on their chest. And this is like 5 minutes after Sunday school began. Puts his head on their chest, immediately falls asleep, sleeps the entire service. He was just tired. He was just tired. So sometimes physical things can affect us. I mean, kids are morning kids and night kids, right? Some kids do really well in the morning, some not so well, just like adults. Behaviors happen because they work. If they didn't work, kids wouldn't do it. So how does this play out at church? Take this little girl. She likes to be picked. She likes to answer all the questions and do all the stuff up front. And when she doesn't get picked, she screams bloody murder. So what do? Do we pick her every time so she won't scream? Probably not. Do we send her upstairs to her mom? Will that work? Will that stop her from wanting to be picked? Probably not, but we could try it, right? So we try it. We send her upstairs. Now, if her mom is cranky and not happy to see her, and she's like, you need to be in Sunday school, sit down and be quiet, and makes her just sit there and she's bored the entire service, the next week, she might not scream as much, right? Because she doesn't want to go upstairs and be bored. However, if her mom is a happy worshiper with a cell phone, and mom wants to worship God and doesn't want to deal with the kid, and she just hands the kid her cell phone, and the kid plays on the cell phone, which is like the best thing ever, the entire service, what do you think that little girl is going to do next week? She might be more screamy. because what she gets out of that behavior is she gets to go play with a cell phone. So if you take the reward out of the behavior will often disappear. The opposite is also true. So if you see good behavior and you reward it, you'll get more of that. So I had a class of older elementary kids, like 9, 10-ish. And we had Sunday school, and then we had church, and they would go to church and they would just act up. I mean, kicking each other and getting on the floor and not paying any attention. I mean, just horrible. But I noticed that there was one kid, probably accidentally, stood up and participated in the worship and raised their hands maybe once, right? But the next week, I made a big deal about it. And I talked about how that kid was the best worshiper. I gave him an award, a little certificate, and a prize. And I said how great it was that they stood up and they raised their hands and they made God so happy that they were worshiping, right? The following week, those little kids that were not paying attention and were smacking each other, they were all standing up and raising their hands during service and singing along. Now, they were also looking at me, right? Making sure that I saw them. And we didn't hand out an award every single Sunday, but I would every once in a while do that, and that would really help. That would really help keep their behavior in check during worship service. When it comes to behavior, it's easy to blame the parents. So maybe they don't have any discipline at home, they don't have any boundaries, and so there's obviously nothing we can do because the parents have failed us, right? Or, I mean, it's easy to fall into it's a character flaw trap as well, right? So we say, that kid is a rule breaker, they're disruptive, they just want to ruin my day. Okay, maybe not. But how do we treat somebody who is rude and rebellious and doesn't have any regard for our feelings, right? I mean, I know what Jesus says about treating others, but what do we say? So if you've got that kid that's rude and rebellious and you're handing out prizes at the end of the class, do you say, no, you don't deserve a prize, you were bad all day, right? Is that how we treat kids? Do we say, why can't you be like everybody else? Look, everybody else is sitting quietly, why can't you? Instead, maybe we should teach kids that they're fearfully and wonderfully made. Maybe we should teach kids that sometimes their body needs to move when everybody else's doesn't, and help them navigate that. Try to separate the behavior from the kid, from their character, right? So what if we saw behavior as kids expressing a need, something that we haven't figured out yet? Rather than seeing a kid that just whacked their neighbor as a little stinker, maybe they're just somebody who's having a hard time and they don't know how to communicate that. Maybe they're tired. Maybe they're hungry. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying tolerate behavior. I'm saying figure it out. If you've tried all the tricks, head over to Able Ministry UPCI's Facebook group. Out there, you will find therapists and teachers and parents and people with disabilities who can give you 6 different perspectives about why something is happening and what you might do that you probably didn't think of. So, I'll see you over there.